At approximately 2:25 in the morning on June 29th, 1967, a 1966 Buick Electra 225 is traveling west on US Route 90 near Slidell, Louisiana. The highway is dark. The Gulf Coast air is heavy and wet. In the front seat are three adults, a driver, a lawyer, and a woman with platinum hair who performed at a Biloxi supper club a few hours earlier and still has another engagement waiting in New Orleans. In the back seat, lying across the vinyl, are three children. They are asleep. The youngest is 3 years old. The car strikes the rear of a tractor trailer at full speed. The roof shears off. The three adults in front are killed instantly. The three children in back survive. The woman was Jayne Mansfield, Broadway star, Playboy icon, the self-made bombshell the press called the next Marilyn Monroe. She was 34 years old. She had 5 children by 3 husbands, a pink mansion on Sunset Boulevard, and a fame so carefully engineered that even her death could not outrun the myths built around it. The world would remember the crash. Almost no one would ask what happened to the children who lived through it. This is the story of those 5 children, scattered across different fathers, different households, and different versions of the same mother. It spans nearly 60 years, from the Pink Palace to a 2025 documentary that finally broke the family's longest silence. It is a story about what children inherit when what they lose is not just a parent, but a myth. To understand what happened to those 3 children in the back seat and to the 2 who were not in the car at all, you have to go back to a girl named Vera Jane Palmer, born on April 19, 1933, in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania. Her father, Herbert Palmer, was a lawyer. He died of a heart attack when Jayne was 3 years old. That detail is not incidental. It is the first line of a pattern that would run through 3 generations of this family: a child, a sudden absence, and a life reorganized around a loss no one fully explains. Decades later, Jayne's own daughter would be 3 years old when she lost her mother on a Louisiana highway. The echo is not symbolic, it is structural. The family's defining wound repeated itself almost exactly, a generation apart. After Herbert's death, Jayne's mother, Vera, remarried a man named Harry Pierce, and the family moved to Dallas, Texas. The girl who arrived in Dallas was already restless in a way that went beyond ordinary childhood energy. She studied piano seriously. She studied violin. She took up dance. She learned languages, German, Spanish, French, absorbing them with the appetite of someone who understood instinctively that the more skills she accumulated, the harder she would be to dismiss. She entered and won beauty contests as a teenager, not because she lacked other ambitions, but because the stage, any stage, answered something inside her that ordinary life could not. There is a particular kind of child who responds to early loss by becoming impossible to overlook, who decides consciously or otherwise that if she makes herself bright enough and loud enough, the world will not be able to look away. Jayne Palmer was that child. Whether she was running toward ambition or away from the grief of a dead father is a question the record does not fully answer. It was almost certainly both. Most self-creation stories begin in loss. What Jayne wanted from a remarkably young age was not just to be seen, but to be studied, admired, discussed, and remembered. She would later tell interviewers and reporters that she had an IQ of 163, that she spoke 5 languages, that she could play piano and violin with serious technical skill. The specific numbers have never been independently verified. Britannica notes that the documented basis for those exact scores remains uncertain, but the impulse behind the claim is worth sitting with. Jayne Mansfield needed the world to understand that the woman inside the body was not the woman the body advertised. She was more deliberate than she appeared, more calculating, more intelligent. The dumb blonde was a character she had invented and then performed with extraordinary precision. And the performance was the product. She was not a victim of the image. She was its architect. And that distinction would matter enormously to her children, who would spend their adult lives trying to excavate the real woman from underneath the character she had so successfully built. She became a mother before she became famous. At 17, still living in Texas, she married Paul Mansfield, a public relations man she had met in high school. On November 8, 1950, Jayne gave birth to a daughter, Jayne Marie Mansfield. The baby arrived while Jayne was still a teenager, still unknown, still married to her first husband in a quiet domestic life that bore no resemblance to the one she would later construct. That timing gives Jayne Marie a position in the family story that none of the other children share. She's the only one who existed before the machinery of fame started turning. She had a mother, not a persona, not a brand, not a cultural product, just a mother. A young woman in a small Texas marriage who held her firstborn and had not yet decided to remake herself into someone the entire country would recognize. The others, born later into increasingly public circumstances, would inherit something far more complicated. Jayne Marie had the real thing, however briefly, that would make her grief, when it came, a different animal entirely. The marriage to Paul Mansfield did not survive Jayne's ambition. She moved to Los Angeles. She enrolled in drama classes at UCLA. She posed for photographers who could see what the camera already knew, that Jayne's body and face and platinum hair were built for a medium that rewarded visual spectacle above almost everything else. She worked her way into the entertainment industry with a ferocity that startled even the people who were used to ambition. By the mid-1950s, Jayne Mansfield had become one of the most photographed women in America. A blonde with a 40-inch bust, a breathy voice she could weaponize at will, and a publicity instinct so sharp it sometimes outpaced the career it was supposed to serve. Broadway came first. The play was Will's success, Spoil Rock Hunter. And it was a sensation, not because Jayne was the greatest actress of her generation, but because she understood something about audiences that many of her peers did not. She knew that the woman who plays dumb while being smart creates a tension the viewer cannot resolve, and that unresolvable tension is what keeps people watching. The play ran through 1955 and 56 and made Jayne Mansfield a name. 20th Century Fox took notice and signed her to a contract, the kind of studio deal that in the 1950s still meant something close to a guarantee of stardom. Playboy featured her multiple times with Jayne's enthusiastic participation because she recognized the magazine as another stage in a career built entirely on stages. She was not embarrassed by the exposure. She courted it. She understood, before most of her contemporaries did, that visibility was currency and that the body the public wanted to see was the same body that could negotiate for better roles, better billing, better pay. She starred in The Girl Can't Help It, a 1956 musical comedy that exploited the contradiction she had already perfected. The woman who looks like a caricature and knows she looks like a caricature and plays the caricature better than anyone else because she is in on the joke and the audience is never quite sure whether they are in on it too. She followed it with the film version of Will's success, Spoil Rock Hunter, which brought her stage triumph to movie screens nationwide. For a brief window, perhaps 2 or 3 years, Jayne Mansfield looked like a star who might last. The box office was strong. The publicity was relentless. The name was everywhere. The press called her the new Marilyn Monroe. The comparison was both a compliment and a trap. It meant Jayne existed not on her own terms, but as a reflection of someone else's template. A copy, a rival, a second choice. Marilyn Monroe was already the most famous woman in the world. The studio system did not need another version of her. It wanted one anyway because the comparison generated headlines and headlines sold tickets, and the entire machinery of mid-century Hollywood ran on the principle that a woman's commercial value lay not in what she could do, but in what she could represent. Jayne understood this game with a clarity that bordered on ruthlessness. She played it with discipline. The photo opportunities engineered for maximum impact, the wardrobe choices calibrated for maximum controversy, the public appearances that were, beneath their apparent spontaneity, meticulously staged events. She once told an interviewer that the real stars were not good actors or actresses, but personalities. She was not being modest. She was describing her own strategic framework. She had decided that fame itself was the product, and she manufactured it with the consistency of an assembly line. But there was a cost to making yourself a brand, and the cost compounded over time. The brand needed constant feeding. It needed new stories, new images, new reasons for the public to keep paying attention. And the family, the growing, complicated, increasingly fragmented family, became raw material for that machine. Mickey Hargitay entered the story on a nightclub stage in the mid-1950s. He was Hungarian born. He had been a Mr. Universe. He was a bodybuilder with a broad chest, a thick accent, and hands that had done real physical labor long before they ever touched the spotlight. When Jayne first saw him, he was performing in Mae West's stage act. Another strong man in a show built around another blonde who had made a career out of sexual provocation and comedic timing. The line that survived in family mythology was Jayne turning to a companion at her table and saying, "I'll have a steak and the man on the left." Whether she said exactly those words or whether the family polished the memory over decades matters less than what the line reveals about the dynamic from the beginning. Jayne chose Mickey the way she chose everything, with instinct, with speed, and with an eye for the image. He was strong. He was loyal. He was visually spectacular. He was willing to be part of the show, and he could build things with his hands, which would matter more than anyone realized at the time. They married on January 13th, 1958. The ceremony was itself a media event, photographed, publicized, and folded into the ongoing production that was Jayne Mansfield's public life. Mickey Hargitay Jr. was born that same year, 1958. Zoltan Hargitay followed in 1960. Mariska Hargitay arrived on January 23rd, 1964. 3 children in 6 years, each born into a household where the boundary between family life and publicity campaign had long since dissolved. Each born under flashbulbs, announced in columns, and absorbed into an image of domestic abundance that was, in its own way, as carefully constructed as any film set. And then there was the house. After the marriage, Jayne and Mickey bought a Mediterranean-style estate at Tetu 100 Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles. The price was $76,000. The property had 25 rooms. It sat on 3.5 acres of land in one of the most photographed neighborhoods in America. It was already a significant home. But Jayne, who understood better than almost anyone in her industry that the private life was simply another set waiting to be dressed, set about transforming it into something no one in Hollywood had ever quite seen before. Every wall was painted pink. The carpets were pink. The curtains were pink. The bathtubs, in plural, were heart-shaped and pink. The swimming pool was heart-shaped too, inscribed at the bottom with the words, "I love you, Janie." There were cupids mounted on the walls, dozens of them, arranged with the density of a theme park. There were chandeliers that dripped with excess. The doorknobs were pink. Guests reported that as many as 40 chihuahuas padded through white shag carpet, so deep and so thick that visitors were asked to remove their shoes at the front door to keep from tracking in the outside world. Jayne herself, giving a tour to a reporter, called the house like living in a wonderful powder box. The Pink Palace was not simply a house. It was the family mythology made physical, an architectural argument that this marriage, this family, this life was defined by love so abundant it had to overflow into every surface and every room and every object. Mickey, who was genuinely skilled with his hands and who had done construction work before Hollywood, built much of the renovation himself. He laid tile in the bathrooms. He shaped wood for the shelving and the trim. He poured the concrete for that heart-shaped pool with his own labor, working in the Los Angeles sun, while Jayne directed the aesthetics from inside. His craftsmanship was in the walls, the floors, the structural bones of the building, the parts nobody photographed. Jayne's vision was on every visible surface, the parts everybody photographed. Together, the house told a truth about the marriage that neither of them would have stated aloud. It was built on real attraction and real physical effort, but it was also built for an audience that was always, always watching. The Pink Palace did not just shelter a family, it proved to the world that the family existed, that the love was real, that the children were happy, that the bombshell was also a devoted wife and mother, and that the entire glittering package was available for public admiration. Architectural Digest would later document the house in detail, preserving the sheer excess of the decor as a kind of cultural artifact, evidence of a time when celebrity domesticity was its own performance art. During the peak years, the late 50s and the first years of the 60s, the image held. Jayne took her children everywhere and said so publicly, often enough that the claim itself became part of the brand. She brought the children to premieres. She brought them on set. She brought them into television studios. A 1966 appearance on the Merv Griffin show captured the family performance at its most vivid and its most strained. Jayne, seated with children around her, joking her way through small-scale chaos, managing the unpredictability of young kids on live television, with the practice ease of a woman who had been performing since adolescence. At one point, she made a joke about having lost Jayne Marie somewhere along the way. The studio audience laughed, and the moment passed. It was a throwaway line, delivered with a smile. But the joke had an edge the audience could not have caught. Jayne Marie was not lost. She was the child from before the fame, the daughter whose relationship with Jayne had been formed in a quieter, more private era, before the Pink Palace, before Mickey, before the full weight of the publicity machine descended. Jayne Marie had been, for a brief time, the only child. She had her mother to herself. And then the family expanded around her, and the myth hardened, and the woman she had known as simply Mom became a figure the world thought it owned. In the trailer for Mariska's 2025 documentary, My Mom Jayne, Jayne Marie said, "In the beginning, I had her to myself." That is a devastating sentence, not because of what it says, but because of what it implies about everything that came after: the gradual loss, the dilution, the realization that the mother she remembered was being replaced in the public record and in the family's own mythology by a character. And that family at its widest contained 5 children, spread across 3 marriages and 3 fathers. Jayne Marie from Paul Mansfield, the oldest, the one with memories. Mickey Jr., Zoltan, and Mariska from Mariska Hargitay, the Pink Palace children, the ones born into the spectacle at its peak. And Tony Simber, born in 1965 from Jayne's 3rd husband, director Matt Simber, whom she had met during a stage production and married with the speed that characterized nearly every major decision she ever made. Each child occupied a radically different position inside the family's emotional architecture. Jayne Marie remembered a private mother and carried that memory like a photograph nobody else could see. Mickey Jr. grew up watching his mother perform and understood, even as a boy, that she was smarter than the act. Zoltan was the physical child, the one who absorbed the family's proximity to danger in his own body. Mariska was born into the fracture itself, the baby who arrived as the marriage was ending and who carried a biological secret she did not yet know. Tony came last, into a 3rd marriage already fraying, the child with the least access to the woman in the center and the most distance from the mythology that had formed around her. They were not a unit. They were a constellation, held together by the gravitational pull of one woman's fame and destined to scatter violently when that gravity disappeared. By the early 1960s, the cracks had already started spreading beneath the pink paint. Jayne's career, which had peaked with the Broadway success and the Fox contract, was losing altitude in ways that were visible to the industry, even if the public had not yet fully registered the shift. The major studio roles had dried up. Fox had not renewed her contract with the enthusiasm it once showed, and the parts coming in now were increasingly low budget, increasingly exploitative, films shot on tight schedules in foreign countries, projects that traded on her body and her name without offering much artistic substance in return. She made films with titles that told their own story: Too Hot to Handle, Promises, Promises, The Loves of Hercules. She was still famous. She was still recognized in public and photographed at events and openings and premieres. She still drew crowds when she showed up. But the fame had changed in character, and the change was irreversible. It was sustained now by publicity stunts and tabloid appearances rather than by the kind of studio prestige that builds a lasting career. The gossip machine around her intensified during this period, rumors linking her name to powerful men, including John F. Kennedy, though the strongest sourcing frames such connections as things Mansfield claimed rather than things that have been independently confirmed. The tabloid atmosphere around her name was itself evidence of the career's new center of gravity. Less art, more scandal; less ascent, more maintenance. The woman who had once headlined on Broadway and starred in studio comedies was navigating a slow, public slide into the world of B-movies and nightclub road dates. And the gap between what she projected and what she was actually living had never been wider. At home, the marriage to Mariska Hargitay cracked open. Their divorce was finalized in 1964. The same year Mariska was born. The timing is almost unbearably precise. Mariska entered the world at the exact moment the family's foundational partnership was being legally dissolved. The Pink Palace still stood on Sunset Boulevard. The heart-shaped pool still held water. The Cupid still hung on the walls. But the marriage that had built all of it was finished, and the children were being redistributed into the kind of custody arrangement that transforms a household into a logistics problem. Mickey Sr. moved out. The home that had been built to prove love existed was now evidence that the love, or at least the marriage, had ended. And beneath the divorce, invisible to everyone outside the innermost circle of the family, lay a deeper secret, one that would take decades to surface, and when it finally did, would rewrite the emotional history of the family from the inside out. Mariska's biological father was not Mickey Hargitay. He was Nelson Sardelli, a nightclub entertainer and singer with whom Jayne had been involved during the final disintegration of her marriage. Mickey raised Mariska as his own from the moment she was born. Whether he knew the truth from the beginning or came to understand it later, he never publicly acknowledged any distinction between Mariska and his biological children. He never treated her differently. He never withdrew his claim on her. The family closed around the secret the way families do, not with a formal agreement or a spoken pact, but with the collective, unspoken understanding that some truths are more dangerous, spoken aloud, than they are kept buried beneath the daily mechanics of raising children, paying bills, and getting through the week. Mariska would not learn the full story until she was an adult, long after the childhood that the secret had shaped was already behind her. When she finally spoke about it publicly in interviews surrounding her 2025 documentary, she framed the revelation as the end of a silence that had defined her relationship to her own identity for 30 years. She said she had been living a lie. She also said, with unmistakable and deliberate force, that Mickey Hargitay was her real father. That biology told one kind of story, but the man who chose her, who raised her in his house, and never once made her feel like anything other than his daughter, told a story that mattered more. Both statements were true. Both had to be true, because the only alternative was a family built on nothing at all. And the fact that they could both be true at the same time tells you everything about the family Jayne Mansfield created. The public story and the private truth were rarely the same thing, and the children were always the ones left holding the gap between them. Jayne married Matt Simber soon after the divorce. Tony was born in 1965, and the family portrait reshuffled once more. One teenager from the first marriage, three young children emotionally bonded to a father who no longer lived in the house, and an infant belonging to a new husband in a new arrangement that was itself already showing signs of strain. The instability did not begin with the crash. By the mid-1960s, it was the family's default condition, a system held together not by structure, but by the centrifugal force of one woman's relentless public energy. And then that system was tested in a way that felt like prophecy. On November 23rd, 1966, Jayne took 6-year-old Zoltan to Jungle Land, USA, an animal park in Sherman Oaks, California, for a publicity photo opportunity. During the visit, a lion attacked the boy from behind, biting into his neck and head with force severe enough to require emergency brain surgery. Zoltan survived. He recovered over time, though the full extent of any lasting effects was never publicly detailed. But the event itself is impossible to look past. The child of spectacle, physically mauled inside another spectacle. The family's mythology had always depended on bringing the children into the frame, on making them visible, available, part of the act. Now one of those children had nearly been killed by the very machinery of visibility his mother had spent her career building. For a while, the damage remained survivable. The family was fraying at every seam, but the threads had not yet fully given way. Then in the summer of 1967, the road ran out. By the late spring of 1967, Jayne Mansfield's life had narrowed to a circuit of nightclub appearances, promotional engagements, and road dates that kept her name in lights even as the wattage dimmed. She was 34 years old. She had 5 children spread across 3 marriages, 2 of which had already ended. She was in divorce proceedings from Matt Simber, her third husband, which meant the pattern was completing itself for the third time. Attraction, marriage, children, fracture, dissolution. She was romantically involved with Sam Brody, a Los Angeles lawyer whose presence in Jayne's life had become a source of constant turbulence. Arguments in public, reconciliations in private, jealousy that bled into the professional relationships around her, and the particular kind of dependency that forms when two people are not good for each other, but cannot seem to stop reaching for each other anyway. Friends and associates later describe Brody as volatile, possessive, and increasingly entangled in the daily logistics of Jayne's career in ways that created friction with everyone else in her orbit. The work still came. It came in the form of club dates in places like Biloxi, Mississippi, where the name Jayne Mansfield still drew a paying crowd even though the name no longer opened studio doors or attracted serious directors. She traveled to these engagements because the engagements paid, and because the engagements were what was available, and because Jayne had never learned how to stop performing, or perhaps had never been in a financial position where stopping was a real option. The expenses of the life she had built, and the house, the children, the image, continued regardless of whether the income still matched them. The woman who had once headlined on Broadway and negotiated with 20th Century Fox was now driving between Gulf Coast cities in the middle of the night, working late shows in supper clubs, and sleeping in motels between appearances. The children came with her, or some of them did, because the schedule did not pause for bedtimes, and the childcare arrangements were as improvised as the rest of her life had become. There is something about Mansfield's final year that resists easy pathos. She was not simply a victim of Hollywood's cruelty toward aging actresses. She was also a woman who had made specific choices about publicity over craft, about spectacle over substance, about serial marriages and serial reinventions, and who was now living inside the consequences of those choices while still trying to outrun them. The fame had not vanished, it had mutated. She was still Jayne Mansfield. She was still the woman with the pink house and the platinum hair and the figure that had sold 1 million magazines, but the version of fame she now inhabited was the kind that paid in club dates and road gigs, not in studio contracts. And the difference between those two economies was the difference between building a career and maintaining an image. That is the image the story needs to hold on to. Not a fallen star in the dramatic, cinematic sense, but a working mother whose work happened to be fame, and whose fame had become a kind of treadmill she could not step off. The Pink Palace still existed. The name still meant something, but the life behind the name had become an exercise in logistics, endurance, and the particular exhaustion of maintaining a public persona when the private scaffolding beneath it has long since been dismantled. What the children later remembered, or more precisely, what they later said about what they could and could not remember, reveals the family's interior more honestly than any public record or magazine photograph could. Mickey Jr., in interviews given decades after the crash, said he knew even as a boy that his mother was really smart, that the bombshell image was a deliberate performance, and that the woman at home, the woman who read books and played instruments and was curious about the world in ways that had nothing to do with how she looked in a swimsuit, was fundamentally different from the woman on magazine covers and movie posters. He looked past the persona because he had grown up watching it being assembled and disassembled on a daily basis. And he understood, in the intuitive way that children understand the things adults believe they are hiding, that the act was an act and that the woman beneath it was more interesting than the character on top. That awareness protected him in some ways. It gave him a mother who was real, not just an image, and burdened him in others because it meant he knew, with the helpless clarity of a child, exactly what the world was getting wrong about Jayne Mansfield, and there was nothing he or anyone else could do to correct it. Zoltan, who had already survived a lion attack at Jungle Land the previous autumn, carried in his body a physical and permanent reminder that the family's proximity to spectacle was not always safe. The scars from the surgery were real. The recovery had been real. The experience of being 6 years old and attacked by a wild animal during what was supposed to be a publicity photo shoot was real. Whatever other memories Zoltan carried from childhood, that one would have been indelible. The moment when the family's mythology of public performance collided with physical danger and the child paid the price. Mariska, at 3 years old in the summer of '67, was too young to understand any of it. The career trajectory, the tabloid machinery, the fraying relationships, the late-night drives. She would later say, repeatedly and with a frankness that landed harder each time she said it, that she had no real memories of her mother at all. Not of Jayne's voice, not of being held, Not of bedtime or breakfast or any of the mundane domestic moments that constitute a child's experience of a parent. Everything she knew about Jayne came from external sources: photographs she studied, film clips she watched, magazine articles she read, Playboy spreads she encountered as an adult and had to reconcile with her need for a mother rather than a centerfold. The stories her siblings told her, the stories her father told her or did not tell her, and the vast cultural archive that preserved Jayne Mansfield as a blonde, a body, a punchline, and a cautionary tale, but almost never as a woman who raised children and played the violin and was more than the sum of her measurements. Mariska's childhood experience of her own mother was, in the deepest and most painful sense, secondhand. She inherited an image, she did not inherit a person. The gap between those two things would take her nearly 6 decades to confront. And beneath the individual memories and the individual silences, there was a deeper pattern at work, one the children could feel even if they could not name it. The family did not talk about Jayne. Not really. Not in the way that families are supposed to talk about a dead parent. Telling stories, sharing grief, keeping the person alive through the accumulated weight of memory spoken aloud. Mickey Hargitay Sr. provided stability and love, but he did not, it seems, provide a framework for processing the loss together. Whether that was his choice or his limitation, or simply the way grief worked in his generation and his cultural background, the result was the same. Each child was left alone with their own version of the mother, and the versions never converged. In the trailer for her 2025 documentary, My Mom Jayne, Mariska describes realizing, after her father Mickey died in 2006, that she had never truly talked with her siblings about their mother. Not about the real Jayne, not about what they actually remembered, what they felt, what they carried in their bodies and their dreams and the quiet hours of their daily lives. The family had survived the crash, but they had survived it separately, each holding a different fragment of the story. None of them comparing fragments, and the grief had frozen into a system that ran on avoidance. The silence was not deliberate cruelty. It was the family's survival mechanism, the agreement, never spoken, that if nobody opened the wound might eventually close on its own. It worked in the sense that they all kept going. It failed in the sense that none of them ever fully processed what had been taken from them. Tony Simber, the youngest, expressed a version of this from the opposite direction. In the same documentary material, he said he was not sure he wanted to know the ugly things. That sentence reveals a particular kind of inheritance. The child who senses that there is something painful at the center of the family story and who has made a decision, conscious or not, rational or not, to keep his distance from it. Tony did not grow up inside the Pink Palace mythology. He did not remember the heart-shaped pool or the pink walls or the 40 chihuahuas. He grew up in the aftermath of the myth's collapse, raised apart from his half-siblings, connected to Jayne through a marriage that was already disintegrating when she died. His version of the mother was the most fragmentary of all 5 children, and he seemed, from the limited public statements he made, to have found a kind of peace in the incompleteness. The fragments were manageable, the full picture might not be. The last night followed a pattern so ordinary it is almost unbearable to reconstruct. On June 28th, 1967, Jayne Mansfield performed at a supper club in Biloxi, Mississippi. It was a late show, the kind of engagement that ended well past midnight in a room full of people who had come to see the name more than the act. The audience was a Gulf Coast crowd paying for an evening with a celebrity whose fame still functioned as a currency, even if the source of that fame had shifted from major studio films to personal appearances. The show ended, the audience went home. And instead of resting, instead of waiting for daylight, instead of doing the sensible thing that exhaustion and common sense both demanded, Jayne prepared to leave immediately. She had a television appearance scheduled in New Orleans the following morning. The schedule, as always, was the thing that could not be argued with. Rather than wait until dawn, Jayne and Sam Brody and a 20-year-old driver named Ronnie Harrison loaded into a 1966 Buick Electra 225. The car was large, a 4-door sedan, built for American highways, with enough room in the back seat for 3 sleeping children to lie down. Harrison took the wheel, Brody sat in the front passenger seat, Jayne sat between them, or beside Brody, in the front. The arrangement was the arrangement of people who had done this before, who knew the rhythm of the late night departure, the long highway drive, the arrival at the next city in time for the next obligation. There was nothing special about this night except that it was the last one. They headed west on US Route 90, bound for New Orleans. The highway was dark and flat, cutting through the Louisiana wetlands in the kind of blackness that exists only in rural America in the hours after midnight. No streetlights, no illumination except the headlights and whatever the moon provided. The air was humid and heavy, the way Gulf Coast air is in late June, thick enough to feel on the skin even through a car window. The adults in the front seat were exhausted from the performance, from the travel, from the accumulated fatigue of weeks and months and years of a life that did not slow down, because slowing down meant losing the one thing, visibility, that still paid the bills. Harrison drove. Brody and Jayne may have talked, or may have dozed, or may have simply sat in the companionable silence of people who had run out of conversation hours ago and were now just enduring the miles. In the back seat were three of Jayne's children, Mickey Jr., who was 8, Zoltan, who was 7, and Mariska, who was 3 years old. They were asleep. They had been folded into this rhythm so many times. The late night departures, the highway drives through the dark, the waking up in a different city, that sleeping in the back of a moving car was, for them, as routine as sleeping in a bed. They did not know where they were going. They did not know what time it was. They did not know the name of the highway or the state they were passing through. They were simply present, the way children are present in their parents' lives, carried along by decisions they did not make, transported through a world they did not choose, asleep while the adults navigated the darkness ahead. What happened at approximately 2:25 in the morning on June 29th, 1967, on US Route 90 near Slidell, Louisiana, was mechanical in its horror and absolute in its consequences. The Buick came upon a tractor-trailer that had slowed or stopped on the highway ahead of them. The truck was hauling a load and moving through the same darkness the Buick was moving through, but at a fraction of the speed. Some accounts, drawing on early reporting that has been widely repeated in the decades since, say the truck was obscured by a low-hanging cloud of mosquito abatement spray that had settled across the road surface in the humid Louisiana night air. The spray trucks were common along the Gulf Coast in summer. The chemical fog they left behind was thick enough to reduce visibility to almost nothing. Whether the spray was the decisive factor, or whether the darkness and the speed and the exhaustion of the driver and the limitations of 1960s headlight technology were sufficient on their own, the result was the same. The Buick struck the rear of the trailer without slowing. The car's momentum carried it beneath the trailer's undercarriage at highway speed. The roof of the Buick was sheared completely off, torn away by the trailer's frame as cleanly as if it had been cut. The violence of the impact was total in the front seat and selective in the back. Ronnie Harrison, the driver, was killed instantly. He was 20 years old. Sam Brody was killed instantly. Jayne Mansfield was killed instantly. She was 34 years old. In the back seat, lower to the floor, below the line where the roof had been torn away, Mickey Jr. and Zoltan and Mariska survived. Their injuries were later described as comparatively minor: cuts, bruises, the physical residue of a collision that had destroyed everything in front of them while leaving them, by some accident of geometry and physics and the placement of bodies in a car, alive. Mariska, who was 3, sustained a zigzag-shaped scar above her upper lip that she would carry for the rest of her life. It became, in time, one of the most quietly recognizable features on American television, though for years she did not speak publicly about its origin. The scar was a map of the night her childhood ended, written on her face in a language she could not read until she was old enough to ask. The crash became a national story within hours. Jayne Mansfield was still one of the most recognized women in America, and her death, violent, sudden, on a dark Louisiana highway, with her children sleeping in the back seat, was the kind of event that collapsed the distance between celebrity and human tragedy in a single morning's headlines. Newspapers ran it on front pages. Television covered it. The name Jayne Mansfield, which had been built through years of careful publicity engineering, now belonged to a different kind of story entirely. The bombshell was dead. The cause was a car crash. The details were terrible. And the public, which had always felt entitled to Jayne's image, now felt entitled to her death. Almost immediately, a rumor began circulating that Mansfield had been decapitated in the crash. The rumor spread fast and took hold with the tenacity of an urban legend that confirmed something people want to believe. In this case, that the death of a sex symbol must be as lurid and as grotesque as the life the public had projected onto her. The story persisted for decades. It was repeated in newspapers, in magazines, in television retrospectives, in conversations that began with, "Did you know?" and ended with a detail that was not true. What actually happened was this. The force of the collision displaced Mansfield's signature blonde wig, which was found lying on the road near the wreckage. Photographs taken at the scene by first responders and press showed the wig on the asphalt in a way that, to observers unfamiliar with the specifics, appeared to be something far worse. The image fused with the horror of the crash and became a myth so durable that no amount of correction has ever fully dislodged it. Britannica and multiple authoritative sources have set the record straight. The decapitation did not occur. But the myth lives on, which means that the children of Jayne Mansfield did not only inherit the grief of their mother's death, they inherited a public narrative about that death that was, in one of its most persistent and most grotesque details, a fabrication they could never fully escape. That is a particular kind of cruelty, a secondary wound layered on top of the primary one. To lose a parent is devastating. To lose a parent and then spend the rest of your life watching the world build a lurid, distorted legend around the loss is something else entirely. The children did not get to own their mother's death. They did not get to grieve in private, in their own language, on their own terms. The death belonged to the public, and the public's version was louder, more persistent, and more interested in spectacle than in the truth of 3 children waking up in a car that no longer had a roof. Jayne Marie Mansfield was not in the car that night. She was the oldest child, the daughter from the first marriage, and she was elsewhere, living her own life at 16, already at a physical distance from the family's daily operations. Her loss arrived differently. She did not wake up inside wreckage. She did not carry the physical scars of the impact, but she carried something none of the others had, actual memories of her mother as a private person, as a young woman before the mythology hardened. Jayne Marie remembered the mother who existed before the Pink Palace, before Mickey Hargitay, before the Fox contract, before the 40 chihuahuas and the heart-shaped pool. In the documentary material that surfaced in 2025, Jayne Marie said simply, "In the beginning, I had her to myself." That sentence contains an entire childhood and its dissolution. She had a mother, then the mother became a star, then the star became a symbol. Then the symbol died on a highway in Louisiana. And Jayne Marie was left holding the memory of the woman before the myth, a memory that nobody else in the family shared and that the public had no interest in hearing about. Mickey Jr. and Zoltan, who had been in the back seat, became the brothers who carried the physical fact of the crash inside their bodies and their recall. They had been there, they had survived. Whatever fragments a child's sleeping mind retains from the moment of impact and its aftermath, the noise, the stillness, the lights arriving later, the absence of voices that should have been there, those fragments belong to them. Mariska had nothing. She was 3 years old. She would later say, and say again, and say with increasing openness as the decades passed, that she had no memory of the accident, and no memory of being told that her mother had died. The defining event of her life existed as a blank in her own experience, an absence where a memory should have been, filled in gradually over the years by other people's accounts, by photographs she studied like evidence, by a cultural record that preserved her mother as a pin-up and a punchline, but almost never as a parent. Tony Simber, at 2 years old, was the youngest and the most remote from the event. He was not in the car that night. He was not with the family on the highway. He was not awakened by the impact or carried from the wreckage. He lost his mother at an age when loss does not register as narrative, and there is no story a 2-year-old can tell himself about what happened, but as architecture. His entire life was built from the beginning around a missing foundation, a space where someone should have been and was not, and the shape of that absence would be as real to him as any presence. Jayne Mansfield's death was the famous part. It was the headline, the myth, the cultural shorthand. The details strangers mentioned at parties and documentaries replayed in slow motion. It was the car, the highway, the wig on the asphalt, the decapitation story that refused to die, no matter how many times it was corrected. But the crash was not the end of the story. It was the hinge. Everything before it, the Pink Palace, the publicity, the marriages, the Broadway triumph, the manufactured image of domestic bliss, belonged to one family. Everything after it belonged to five separate people, each carrying a different fragment of the same shattered inheritance, none of them able to see what the others held. The real story of Jayne Mansfield's death is not what happened at 2:25 in the morning on a Louisiana highway. It is what happened in the decades that followed, inside five lives that never stopped being shaped by that single, irreversible moment. If you're finding this story as compelling as I do, take a moment to subscribe. There's so much more to this family that the public never saw, and we're just getting started. After the funeral, the family that had once been photographed as a single, glamorous, pink saturated unit became something quieter, more fractured, and more difficult to see. The children scattered into the care of different households, and the redistribution happened along lines that had already been drawn before the crash. Lines of custody, of paternity, of which adult was responsible for which child. Mariska Mickey Jr. and Zoltan went to live with Mickey Hargitay Sr. and his wife Ellen. Tony Simber went to his father, Matt Simber. Jayne Marie, at 16, was the oldest and the most complicated case. Old enough to understand fully what had happened, too young to be independent, and connected to a family system that was now reorganizing itself around an absence so large it distorted everything around it. It was Ellen Hargitay who became, in every practical and emotional sense, the mother who remained for the three middle children. She had not given birth to them. She had not been part of the Pink Palace mythology or the Sunset Boulevard years or the magazine spreads that presented Jayne and Mickey as Hollywood's most photogenic couple. She had entered Mickey's life after the divorce, after the spectacle, after the years when Jayne and Mickey together had built their monument to romantic excess. Ellen arrived into a family that was already broken and did the unglamorous, unphotographed work of putting it back together. She made meals. She drove children to school. She managed the daily logistics of a household that contained three kids who had lost their mother in the most public and horrifying way imaginable, and who needed, more than anything, someone who would simply be there in the morning. Mariska later said she called Ellen Mom, and the way she said it in interviews decades afterward, with a directness that did not invite pity or sentimentality, made it clear that the word was not a substitution or a consolation prize. It was accurate. It was earned. Ellen was the person who actually did the daily work of mothering. That she was not the original mother, not the famous mother, not the mother the world remembered or mourned, did not diminish what she provided. It made the family's emotional architecture more layered and more honest than the public version. The version built on pink paint and heart-shaped pools there had ever been. Mickey Hargitay Sr. himself became a different kind of figure after the crash. During the marriage to Jayne, he had been the strong man beside the bombshell, the Mr. Universe who built the Pink Palace with his hands, while Jayne directed the aesthetic vision, the supporting player in someone else's carefully managed production. After Jayne's death, stripped of that role, he became something quieter and more essential, a father. Not a celebrity father, not a father performing fatherhood for cameras, just a father. By most accounts, he raised the children with steadiness, with physical affection, and without ostentation. He did not push them toward show business. He did not attempt to recreate the family's former publicity apparatus or to trade on Jayne's name for his own benefit. He provided the kind of domestic stability that does not photograph well and does not generate magazine features, but that traumatized children need more than almost anything else. The stability of a man who gets up every day and does the same thing, who is where he says he will be, who does not disappear. He was sturdy, he was consistent, he was there. And he carried, throughout the decades that followed, the knowledge that the family he had built with Jayne had contained a secret he may or may not have fully understood at the time. That the youngest of the three children in his care, the daughter he loved as completely as any parent can love a child, was not biologically his. If Mickey knew about Sardelli, he never let it change his behavior. Mariska was his daughter. The birth certificate said so. The daily reality said so. The way he treated her, and by every account available, said so. And when Mariska, as an adult, finally learned the truth and had to decide what to do with it, the fact that Mickey had never wavered became the foundation of her response. She did not reject him. She did not rewrite the story. She said he was her father, and she meant it, and the conviction in her voice when she said it was itself a kind of testament to what he had built in the quiet years after the crash. A household where the children knew they were wanted, even if the reasons they needed a new household in the first place were too painful to discuss openly. The children grew up. They diverged. And the paths they chose, considered together across 5 lives and 5 decades, read like 5 separate arguments about what to do with the inheritance of a famous, tragic, complicated mother. Each child made a different wager about how much of the past to carry forward and how much to leave behind. Each built an adult life that was in some legible way a response to the childhood that had been broken apart on a Louisiana highway in 1967. But before those adult lives took shape, there was the matter of the silence, the decades-long family-wide silence about Jayne that functioned not as a conspiracy or a deliberate agreement, but as the path of least resistance in a household where the wound was too large and too public to examine safely. Each child processed Jayne's death alone. Each built a private version of the mother that served their own survival. Jayne Marie had the early memories, the mother before the myth, and she guarded them. Mickey Jr. had the knowledge that Jayne was smarter than the image, that the bombshell act was a strategy, and he carried that understanding like a private correction of the public record. Zoltan had the scars, from the lion, from the crash, and the physical resilience that comes from surviving things that should have killed you. Tony had protective distance, the deliberate decision not to dig too deeply into a history that might not survive the excavation. And Mariska had the blank, the complete absence of memory, the experience of growing up as the daughter of the most famous dead sex symbol in America without being able to remember a single moment of actually being her daughter. The blank was, in its own way, the loudest inheritance of all because it meant that everything Mariska knew about Jayne came from other people, from siblings, from her father, from a culture that had reduced her mother to a handful of images and a car crash story, and none of it felt like enough. Mickey Hargitay Jr. made the most deliberate break from the family pattern. In 1980, at the age of 22, he opened a plant business in Los Angeles. He called it Mickey Hargitay's Plants. The name was his father's, not his mother's, and the business was rooted, in every literal and metaphorical sense, in the ground. He grew things. He sold things that grew. He spent his days with soil and sunlight and the slow, patient rhythms of vegetation, which is about as far from the accelerated, image-driven, flashbulb-punctuated world of Jayne Mansfield's career as a person can get while still living in Los Angeles. Mickey Jr. later described the choice in language that functioned as both career description and family manifesto. His family had always reached for the stars, he said, and he had wanted to keep his feet on the earth. That is not a condemnation of Jayne. It is a renegotiation. The child of spectacle, choosing substance, the son of a woman who lived for visibility, choosing a life that grows quietly and does not need an audience to justify its existence. He ran that plant store for decades. He is still associated with it today. The constancy of that choice, the sheer duration of his commitment to a single, unspectacular enterprise, is itself a kind of response to a childhood defined by volatility, reinvention, and the chronic instability of a mother who married 3 times, moved between households and never stayed in one configuration long enough for the children to feel settled. Zoltan Hargitay took a path that was adjacent to the family's world, but deliberately behind the camera rather than in front of it. Like his father, the man who had built the Pink Palace with his own hands, who had laid tile and shaped wood and poured concrete for a heart-shaped pool, Zoltan worked with physical materials. He went into film and television production, where he accumulated credits as a set carpenter and construction crew member. He built the physical structures on which other people's stories were told. He constructed the walls of fictional rooms, the facades of fictional buildings, the sets that appeared solid on camera and were hollow behind. There is an almost too perfect resonance in that career choice. The child of Jayne Mansfield, a woman who built the most elaborately constructed facade in Hollywood, spending his adult life literally building facades for a living. Whether Zoltan saw the parallel or would have found it interesting is unknown. He did not give many interviews. He did not seek attention. He showed up, did the work, and went home. A rhythm that his mother, for all her talents, had never been able to sustain. The lion attack at Jungle Land, which had nearly killed him at 6, left scars that were both physical and, one assumes, psychological, though Zoltan did not speak publicly about the lasting effects. What is visible from the outside is a man who survived 2 extraordinary incidents of violence in his first 7 years of life, the lion and the crash, and responded not with spectacle or self-dramatization, but with quiet, physical, behind-the-scenes labor. He took the family's legacy of craftsmanship, inherited from Mickey Sr., and applied it to a career that required skill, patience, and the willingness to be invisible. Jayne Marie Mansfield, the oldest of the 5, lived most of her adult life at the greatest possible distance from the family's public mythology, a distance that looked from the outside like deliberate withdrawal, and that may have been exactly that. She was the child who remembered Jayne as a person, not as an icon or a cultural artifact or a name attached to a decapitation rumor. She had been the only child once. She had known the mother before the persona, before the platinum wig, before the pink palace. And she had watched from an increasingly peripheral position as the family expanded and the mythology consumed the woman she remembered. After the crash, Jayne Marie did not pursue fame. She did not write a tell-all memoir. She did not sell her story to tabloids, though the story she could have told. The oldest daughter of the most famous sex symbol of the 1950s, the child who had her mother to herself before the world took her away, would have commanded enormous public interest. She chose instead a kind of resolute privacy that lasted decades. She lived quietly in Los Angeles. She raised her own family. She did not trade on the Mansfield name for commercial advantage or public sympathy. She appeared occasionally at family events and in the orbit of her siblings' public moments, but she did not seek the spotlight and she did not seem to miss it. When she surfaced in the 2025 documentary material, the line she gave was the one that cut deepest. In the beginning, I had her to myself. It was a sentence about childhood. It was also a sentence about loss, not just the loss of the crash, but the earlier, slower loss of a mother who had chosen fame over intimacy and then died before the choice could ever be revised. Tony Simber, the youngest, built his adult life at the farthest remove from the Mansfield mythology of any of the 5 children. He was raised by Matt Simber, his father, in a household entirely separate from his half-siblings. He did not grow up with Mickey Jr. and Zoltan and Mariska in Mickey Hargitay's home. He did not have Ellen as his daily mother figure. He did not share bedrooms or dinner tables or holidays with the children who had been in the car that night. He had a different father, a different household, a different daily rhythm, and therefore a fundamentally different relationship to the loss. Where the Hargitay children had each other, even if they did not talk about the deepest things, Tony had the particular solitude of the youngest child from a dissolved marriage, raised at a distance from the siblings who shared his mother, but not his daily life. He had been 2 years old when Jayne died. He had no memories of her, not a voice, not a face, not a sensation, and nothing. What he had instead was the knowledge, accumulated over years, that his mother was famous, that she had died in a way the public found endlessly fascinating, and that the world's version of her was both inescapable and, in almost every particular that mattered, inadequate. Tony spent much of his adult life working in Las Vegas in real estate at a considerable distance from both Hollywood and the entertainment industry that had created and consumed his mother. He was private by temperament and by conscious choice. He did not give interviews, he did not seek attention, he did not attempt to monetize the Mansfield name or to position himself as a spokesman for the family's legacy. When the documentary project emerged in 2025, Tony participated, but with visible caution. His statement that he was not sure he wanted to know the ugly things was not a refusal to engage with his mother's story. It was an honest reckoning with the cost of knowledge, the recognition that understanding Jayne Mansfield fully, in all her complexity and all her contradictions, might require confronting material that would cause pain without offering resolution, and that the safety of partial knowledge had served him well enough for 60 years. And then there was Mariska, whose trajectory became the most publicly visible, the most culturally significant, and in many ways the most deeply ironic of all 5 children. She grew up in Mickey's household with Ellen as her daily mother and the ghost of Jayne as the mother she could not remember. She had no memories of Jayne's voice, no memories of being held, no memories of the mundane intimacies that constitute a child's experience of a parent. What she had was a scar above her lip, a famous last name, and a cultural archive that presented her mother as a body and a punchline rather than as a human being. She became an actress, the same profession her mother had pursued with such ferocity and such complicated results. But Mariska's career unfolded in a completely different register. Where Jayne had traded on visibility and provocation, Mariska built her career on craft and durability. She auditioned. She took small roles. She put in years of work that nobody outside the industry noticed. And then, in 1999, she was cast as Detective Olivia Benson on Law and Order. Special Victims Unit, a role she would play for more than 25 consecutive years, making her one of the most recognized and most respected figures on American television. The role transformed her public identity. Mariska Hargitay was no longer primarily known as Jayne Mansfield's daughter. She was known as Olivia Benson, an investigator, a protector, a woman defined by competence and moral seriousness rather than by her appearance. The distinction between mother and daughter was not accidental. It read, to anyone paying attention, as a lifelong correction. The daughter of the bombshell building a career that rested on authority and substance rather than spectacle. Jayne had been famous for how she looked. Mariska became famous for what she did. The two kinds of fame existed in a quiet, unspoken dialogue across the decades, and the daughter's version was, in some sense, an answer to the mother's. Not a rejection exactly, but a revision, a demonstration that a Mansfield woman could be known for something other than her body. But professional success did not resolve the personal inheritance. The questions Mariska carried: who was her mother, really? What had Jayne been like in private? What did the siblings remember that she could not? Remained unanswered through decades of career success and public recognition. It was not until after Mickey Hargitay Sr. died in 2006 that the silence began to crack. With the father gone, the man who had held the family together through steadiness and the unspoken agreement not to discuss the hardest things, Mariska began slowly to reach toward the past she had been living beside without ever examining directly. She started asking her siblings questions. She started looking at photographs and films and interviews not as artifacts of a cultural icon, but as evidence left behind by a mother she had never known. The result of that process was My Mom Jayne, the documentary that premiered in the Cannes Classic program on May 17, 2025. It had its North American premiere at the Tribeca Film Festival on June 13th. It debuted on HBO and Max on June 27, 2025, almost exactly 58 years, to the day after the crash that killed Jayne Mansfield on a Louisiana highway. The film was not a conventional biographical documentary. It was a family reckoning. Mariska and her siblings gathered together for the first time in a deliberate way, doing the thing they had never done in nearly 6 decades of shared loss, talking about their mother openly, honestly, and in each other's presence, with the understanding that the conversation would be seen by millions. The documentary's most significant revelation was Mariska's public acknowledgement that Nelson Sardelli, not Mickey Hargitay, was her biological father. She did not present this as gossip or scandal or tabloid ammunition. She presented it as the last and deepest layer of a family system that had been built from its very origins on the gap between performance and reality. The final secret in a family that had been organized around secrets and omissions and carefully maintained appearances from the moment Jayne first decided to make herself into someone the public would pay to watch. The secret of Mariska's paternity was not separate from the story of the Pink Palace and the heart-shaped pool and the 40 chihuahuas. It was the purest expression of the same principle. The family's public story was always, in some essential way, different from the private truth, and the children were always the ones who paid the price of that difference. Mariska said she had been living a lie for 30 years, and then she said that the lie had coexisted all along with a truth she would never abandon. That Mickey Hargitay was her father, that his love was not diminished by biology, that the man who got up every morning and raised her and never once made her feel like anything other than his own daughter was more real to her than any DNA test could be. The documentary brought the siblings together in public for the first time in years, not as props in someone else's publicity event, but as participants in their own story, telling it for the first time on their own terms. At Mariska's 2013 Hollywood Walk of Fame ceremony, the family had gathered briefly, and the photograph from that day showed the 5 children of Jayne Mansfield standing together as adults, older, weathered, separate, carrying different versions of the same loss. The 2025 premieres brought them together again, this time as collaborators in the difficult and necessary act of reclaiming their mother from the myth the world had constructed around her death. As of 2025, the children of Jayne Mansfield are spread across different lives, different cities, and different relationships to the name they share. Mariska Hargitay is 61 years old. She lives in New York, still working, still carrying the scar above her lip from a car crash she does not remember. Mickey Hargitay Jr. is 67. He still runs the plant business he opened more than 4 decades ago, still keeping his feet on the ground. Zoltan Hargitay is 65, still working behind the scenes in the industry his mother once tried to conquer from the front. Jayne Marie Mansfield is 74, living quietly, holding the oldest memories. Tony Simber is 60, private, based in Las Vegas, still deciding how much of the story he wants to carry. This story is not about the death of a bombshell. It is about what happens when a woman builds herself into a public spectacle so complete that it nearly erases the private person underneath and then dies before she can decide which version of herself she wants her children to remember. Jayne Mansfield was brilliant, ambitious, self-made, and deeply flawed. She was a better musician than most people knew and a worse judge of men than she ever admitted. She built a mythology of love and domesticity on Sunset Boulevard, and the mythology outlived the love and the domesticity by decades. What her children inherited was not fame or money or the Pink Palace. It was fragmentation, different fathers, different memories, different distances from the same woman, and 58 years of trying to assemble a complete picture from the pieces each of them held. The tragedy is not only that Jayne Mansfield died young on a dark highway, it is that her children spend the rest of their lives discovering that even the family story they thought they knew had been in part a performance, and that the real woman, the one they each needed in a different way, was buried somewhere beneath the image, waiting to be found.